return of the gods, according to indigenous traditions, as I mentioned, whether we go back to the Aztecs, the Mayans, or we talk about the Hopis, or we're talking about the Assyrians, the Sumerians, prophecies of the return of the gods involve them coming in spacecraft and portals. Now that could have been because they were survivors from Atlantis with advanced technologies that left the planet at the end of the Younger Dryas period around 9600 BC, which is documented using ice core samples as a period where the Earth went through a great cataclysm or a sudden warming up, which corresponds to Plato saying that's when Atlantis actually submerged under the waters. So that end of the Younger Dryas period does suggest that, yeah, there was a rapid heating of the Earth, and this is how Atlantis sank. Inner Earth beings, those either from Atlantis or from Hyperborea or Lemuria, earlier civilizations that have escaped global catastrophes that went under Earth's surface, and then would return periodically to help bring about civilization. Or actually extraterrestrials, whether we're talking about seeders, this is an intergalactic association of extraterrestrials seeding worlds or human worlds around our local universe, or the Anunnaki. So far, what I focused on is the return of the gods according to these ancient indigenous traditions. So now we're going to start looking at how organized religion describes all this. So this is where we get to the idea of the second coming in world religions. Zoroastrianism. Now, this is the remnants of what was once a major organized religion in the Middle East. And in Zoroastrianism, you had a belief in a second coming. And in this belief system, what the Zoroastrians believed in was, quote, a third and last saviour will be born into the world named Saoshyant. He will usher in the final judgment, grant the drink of immortality to men, and bring about a new world. I mentioned just earlier about Maximilian Lafayette saying that the return of the Anunnaki, that they would bring back this original DNA which would allow people to live a much longer life. So there we can understand that there's a kind of connection between restoring the original DNA and the drink of immortality. Now we have Buddhism. Now in Buddhism you have the tradition of Maitreya being part of this second coming. Quote, Maitreya will descend to earth from his present residence in the Tishita heaven. This fifth Buddha will restore the teachings, Dharma, of Gautama Buddha and convert this earth into a Buddhist paradise at the climax of a time of increasing degeneracy. So we clearly have again this motive of whether it's a return of the gods or a second coming, that this is all going to happen at a time of great global turmoil, degeneracy. And right now, in this period of history, I think it's quite clear we are in that phase of history. Shambhala and the second coming. So the Kala Chakra Tantra, which is associated with Buddhism, but also connects with indigenous tantric belief systems in the Himalayas. That prior to Buddhism you have the tantric tradition. So the Kala Chakra Tantra is connected to that. So that predicts a time when evil forces will engulf this world. Shambhala will then manifest visibly, and its righteous king will go forth with his armies to conquer evil and re-establish the moral order, the Dharma. So this is Shambhala, the second coming. And it's very interesting. There was a book in the 1800s by Edward Bulwer Lytton called Vril, the Coming Race. And in that book, Vril, the Coming Race, it described that at a much later period, once the inner earth civilization had reached a certain stage of development, and once the surface of humanity had become so unstable and so corrupt that there would be beings from the inner earth, literally armies emerging from the inner earth, using this vril power, and that they would be able to harness this vril power to have incredible psychic abilities that could enable them to use these advanced technologies, and that they would conquer the earth. And that was actually one of the things that really spurred the Germans, the Thule Society in Germany in the interwar period during the Weimar Republic, and that was appropriated by Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, the Nazi SS, that they believed in this idea of vril force that could be harnessed by pure Aryan peoples who achieved a certain state of consciousness which would enable them to use or have access to powerful technologies. Hinduism, you have something similar. So here the avatar is Kalki. He is prophesied as the 10th and final incarnation of the Hindu god Vishnu. So Kalki returns and leads a great army to end Kali Yuga, which is the age of ignorance. So Hinduism has this belief in a triune Godhead, Vishnu, Brahma and Shiva. Vishnu is the god of preservation, and when there would be corruption, Vishnu would come at that time, and he would bring back or restore the balance. So this would be Kalki. So Kalki, the 10th incarnation of Vishnu, would usher in a Satya Yuga, the golden age. So we would transition from this corrupt era, the Kali Yuga, which is what we're in now, into this golden age, the Satya Yuga. Those are some of the organized religions that have these prophecies of a second coming, but they also believe in a multiplicity of gods. Now we're going to get to the organized religions that are predicated today on a singular or powerful God. So these are the Abrahamic religions, and they have also prophecies of a second coming. When we look at the timeline of Abrahamic religions, it's worth pointing out that initially the prophecies involved a return of the gods, a return of the Elohim, but that was changed at a certain point. So if we look at, say, on that timeline of Abrahamic religions, you see around 1400 BC, this is the time, well, up until 600 BC, this is the time of the Israel kingdoms, King Saul, David, Solomon, that these kings of ancient Israel, that they lived at a time where in Israel it was perfectly kosher to believe in a multiplicity of gods. But then, around 600, the priests decided that no, we don't want to have this anymore. We're not going to talk about a multiplicity of gods or multiplicity of Elohim. We're now going to talk about one supreme God. And we're going to talk about a second coming of his Messiah, of the Anointed One. And the Anointed One, and I covered this in my last webinar, World Religions and Extraterrestrial Contact, where I described the Anointed One as being a person chosen to meet with one of the gods, one of the extraterrestrials, and that the Anointed One was actually a person who went through a purification process, a decontamination process, where once this human messenger was taken up on one of the spacecraft to meet with a leader of that spacecraft or of the Galactic Federation or Confederation or whatever association was relevant, that they would go through a decontamination process where they would have all these oils and ointments used to decontaminate them. Then they would have their meeting, and that they would come back to the Israeli society. And because this person had gone through that purification process and explained what he had gone through, that's when the Israelis came up with this idea that God's prophet, or the prophet of the gods, or the Messiah of the gods, was one that was anointed, who had gone through this purification process. So the prophecies of the return of the gods, that was very common in Israeli society up until around 600 BC, that was subsequently transformed into a second coming of the anointed one, of the Messiah. And this is very well laid out and described in the work of Paul Wallace in Escaping from Eden, and Mauro Bellino in The Naked Bible. And again, just go to my last webinar, World Religions and Extraterrestrial Contact, where I describe them and show clips of them talking about how the word Elohim was transformed by different religious conclaves, first of the Jewish conclave around 600 BC, and then a Christian conclave which occurred around around 350 AD, which was the Council of Nicaea, that they redefined Elohim to being this kind of singular, all-powerful God. Yahweh, Father, Lord, Adonai, these are some of the terms that are used. That today, a lot of religious leaders, pastors, interpret that for being this kind of singular, powerful God, but Bellino and Wallace clearly point out that this is a distortion of the earlier beliefs of the Hebrews of this multiplicity of gods, or Elohim, that were all part of this creation that goes back much further to the Sumerian texts, because ancient Israeli culture was a derivative of the Sumerian texts. And that's something that modern day scholars, religious scholars, are very reluctant to acknowledge, because otherwise that would mean that people would go off and start studying the Sumerian texts and find out that the Elohim actually means a multiplicity of gods. So this takes me to Jesus' second coming. So where does the concept of the second coming of Jesus come from? Well, in the Gospel of John, chapter 14, sections 1 to 3, you have the following. In my Father's house are many mansions, which some people have interpreted to mean spacecraft, not spacecraft, planets, many planetary civilizations. That Earth is just one of many planets hosting human life that has been created through God, or the Father, or the Elohim. So it continues, if it were not so, I would have told you, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. So I will come again. So this is where you actually have the idea of the second coming, that Jesus will come again. And that earlier reference to a house of many mansions, if it refers to planets or spacecraft, could Jesus come from one of these planets or one of these spacecraft? Or, of course, it could be another dimensional realm, as many might believe in the Christian world. Jesus, his message was revolutionary at the time. After he was crucified or killed, eliminated by the priesthood, the priesthood represented the deep state of the day. They were the controllers of the day, because the power was in the priesthood as far as Israel was concerned. As far as the Roman Empire was concerned, it was power was invested in the emperor and of course the Senate. So this is where the power was. So I think the book of Revelation was very likely an attempt to co-opt the popularity of Jesus into this idea of a future apocalypse. So now we get to another monotheistic Abrahamic tradition, which is the second coming in Islam. So in Islam, you have the idea of the Imam Mahdi. Quote, "After the lesser signs of the hour appear and increase, mankind will have reached the stage of great suffering. Then the awaited Mahdi will appear. He is the first of the greater and clear signs of the hour. There will be no doubt about his existence." And so many Muslims now believe that we have arrived at the day of judgment. And from the Muslim perspective, we have reached the final days, because what has happened over the last 30 years, I guess you could date it back to the first Iraq War, when you actually had the US establishing bases in Saudi Arabia and then launching a war against Iraq, Saddam Hussein, that in 1991, that represented this, from the Muslim world, this was the time, the end times, because this was a new Christian crusade against the Muslim world. From 1991, this is when you have many Muslims believing we have entered the final days, which is a core tenet of the Islamic belief system, and so they began to look for the coming Imam Mahdi. Today you have people claiming to be the Mahdi, and some believe that the Mahdi has already come, and now they're looking for the second sign. So what is the second sign? So the Mahdi is followed by a false Messiah. So the Mahdi has come already, presumably to resist the American Crusaders, those that waged war against Islamic kingdoms, principally Saddam Hussein, and of course Afghanistan, the Emirate of Afghanistan. That this was, for many Muslims, this was clearly a new crusade that was being waged against the Muslims, and the Mahdi rode up in resistance. So the Mahdi rises up in resistance. That resistance has now come and gone, and now you have a period that's followed by a false Messiah. So the Mahdi will rule until the false Messiah, Al-Masih al-Dajjal, appears, who will spread oppression and corruption. The only ones who will know him well and avoid his evil will be those who have great knowledge and Imam. So the false Messiah, I think for many Muslims, they would equate that with the American Empire. Some today might look at Joe Biden and look at him as the false Messiah, as someone who is at the forefront of this reign of global corruption and oppression. And we're certainly seeing that in not only around the world, but also in the United States now, where there is a lot of oppressive policies that are being pursued. So, the Mahdi is followed by a false Messiah. Exactly who that is, anyone can take a guess. Then you're going to have the false Messiah and Jesus. So what role does Jesus play? The false Messiah will remain for a while, destroying mankind completely, and the earth will witness the greatest fitna, tribulation in its history. So isn't that what's happening right now?